I never thought we were going to be in a world where we'd have computers that could talk to us and could write code. We are still at a point where my input on the code that's written has dramatic effect on the quality of the code. The degree to which that is true is so much less than it was a year ago or 2 years ago. And the work that I'm doing has changed so much. So that magic boundary was crossed a long, long time ago.
This idea of not just automating the work, but you're actually automating the act of automation. So you're building agents that can basically tell you what else you can automate. If you keep on using automation to find what else could be automated, is there a ceiling at all?
What's interesting is that these kind of recursive improvement loops are happening at several levels in all of this. So you're seeing the models themselves have these recursive loops, both in the pre-training and then in the post-training as well. There's these agentic layers, like Claude Code, which is itself being recursively improved. And then people like me are building other recursive improvements on top of that. There's a moment between when you start working with the AI and when you're comfortable that the AI is on the same page as you. I've seen a dev give 3-line instructions to the AI, and the AI came back with a 15-page plan. And he was like, look, isn't that amazing? And I was like, no, look at the entropy between what you've just told them and what they've decided.
And here we are. Thanks for making time and joining me on the pod. It's been a minute. So just before I hit record, we were talking about Stack Overflow and how, I want to say 2 years ago, maybe, you called out the the demise and ultimate death, dare I say, of Stack Overflow.
Yeah.
So I thought I wanted to, that's actually a really good place to start, I thought. In fact, you wrote this about 2 years ago before it was kind of obvious to anyone else, right? And the post that you did, which is almost like a mini essay, was more about how AI might break the way humans share knowledge, and Stack Overflow was the prime example there, right? Am I correct in saying this?
Yeah, that was right.
And more recently, you wrote about something much more personal, which really struck a chord with me. And that was the moment you kind of felt your own value as a program was starting to decline.
Yeah. I hope I'm less right with that one than I was with the Stack Overflow one.
Sorry, I've started on a positive note, but one thing I wanted to maybe kick us off with is I was curious what actually changed between those two posts. It's been 2 years, and a lot has happened in the world of tech and AI in particular. What is your assessment? What, if you were to summarize it, what did actually change?
I think there've been a few different phases. So the first phase, which was kind of in progress when I wrote that about Stack Overflow, was essentially the AI as an advisor. Mm-hmm. And so you would go to it with your problems the same way we used to go to Stack Overflow with our problems back in the day, and ask it questions. And even then it was good enough that really for almost all questions, it was going to answer them, which is why I wrote the piece about Stack Overflow. And then AI, the place that you referenced it, moved from ChatGPT into the IDE, and it became an assist. And we would program with AI assisting. I mean, I guess a lot of people went for the kind of tab modality where they'd start writing and then tab to let AI finish it. I never actually went to that. I didn't like it. And instead I went straight to the set where you start telling it in plain English what you want it to program.
Right.
That was the second phase, or maybe the second and third phases. And then the one beyond that is essentially kind of the extended version of that, where now you write extremely long prompts, and we're now moving to this paradigm of factory prompts. So what's changed over that time? I think the ability of the AI to understand and hold multi-turn instructions and do them well, and the caliber of its programming, the caliber of the programming, its output keeps going up and up.
Yeah. So if we go back to that first, I'll call these essays. I know they were LinkedIn posts, but they're really mini essays. And so if we go back to that first one, let's call it the Stack Overflow one, I mean, again, I read it and it almost read like an early warning, right? It was kind of very sobering in many ways. So I was curious, what was it that you saw back then 2 years ago? Because again, I think, so again, just before I hit record, we said that the Stack Overflow traffic now confirms, I think, what you called 2 years ago. But what is it 2 years ago, at a time when no one basically was saying that you saw that kind of made you write this?
I think I knew that I was pretty exemplary of users on Stack Overflow, or at least probably more the reader than the writer. So my Stack Overflow rank puts me in the top 2%, but like by being representatively ignorant early on in the curve of technologies.
Right.
So I asked the right questions. I mean, the best question you could have ever asked on Stack Overflow is how to undo in Git, right? And everything else is like downstream of that. But the more dumb question you ask early on in any given curve, like the more points you accrue. And I was just early in the curve of Rails and JavaScript and various other things. And so I just saw that I wasn't going there at all. And I was like, if this is true for me, it's going to be true for other people. And it turned out it really was.
So what was that behavioral change from a day-to-day perspective, the way you would write code, pre that post versus when you wrote it? What were you doing before that you were no longer doing? Just literally just going to Stack Overflow, or were there any other changes?
So with regard to Stack Overflow in particular, or just like how did AI change it?
More the latter, I suppose.
There's a lot less groundwork that you have to do. And I think especially as a solo developer, so I like to build stuff as correctly as possible and as high quality as possible. And the quality part, like, kind of broadly comes down to my own personal taste and how much it's evolved over the years. But the correctly part, a lot of that comes down to how much reading do I do around the topic, and to what degree am I aware of the best way to solve the problem. Because if you can solve the problem the best way, you will save yourself a lot of downstream pain. And previously, that reading around was really time consuming. It was hard. So it was hard to know the unknown unknowns. And especially if you're just itching to get on with something, like I think the normal MO for most developers is like, if you've got a solution, run with it. But my preference has always been to look for the most correct solution. And AI completely changed that, because I could just ask it, what's the most correct solution in these circumstances? What would different teams do, and what would be the pros and cons? And there's no reading, there's just the question and the answer, and then you pick which one you want to roll with.
Yeah. In that particular essay, you make even a sort of more powerful point, which is this idea of knowledge essentially going private, for lack of a better term, instead of being out in the open, if you were consuming it and storing it via repositories like Stack Overflow. Why did you feel that was a problem? I mean, you kind of made a good case, but for anyone who has not read that, I would love to hear you talk about why this becomes actually a problem and what the downstream implications are.
So it's interesting to think now, like, how it feels in the context of kind of what we now know and have seen. But the internet is like all these different micro repositories of shared human knowledge. IMDb is like a bunch of shared human knowledge about like actors. Wikipedia is shared human knowledge. Stackopedia was shared human knowledge about programming. Like the real power of the internet has been the ability to incentivize people to share the best of their knowledge and to groom that and to make that available to other people. And people who got that right were very successful. With AI, there's no incentive to. There was a virtuous cycle with all of those sites whereby they would attract attention. Some small proportion of that attention would either have a need, like a direct need for the thing that was on the site, or a need for social validation that would drive them to contribute to the site, and they'd get some small number of virtual internet points back that made them feel happier, and then that virtuous cycle continues, and you get these things come by virtue of people feeling appreciated. And then we move to the AI world, and there's no, like, people aren't going to those sites in the same way. The Tailwind founders famously, like, recently had to completely change their business model, because whilst their business model was that Tailwind CSS, which is kind of a design framework which powers tons of sites on the internet, made its money by people coming to Tailwind CSS, reading the documentation, and then a small number of people buying the premium template that they had on there.
Yeah.
But nobody goes and reads the documentation anymore because the LLM knows how to do it. And so their sales drop through the floor. I think there's like maybe these two things happening simultaneously. One is there's a lack of incentive to go and contribute to these shared repositories in quite the same way, because the LLMs are addressing the needs that these repositories used to cater to. But then the other concern I had was who owns the knowledge. Like so one, it's not being generated, but two, who has it? And I didn't really know the answer to that. I mean, one thing that's very different now than it was in March 23 when I wrote that essay is that there are several extremely strong and worthy competitors to OpenAI. And that's very reassuring, because when there was just OpenAI, it wasn't very reassuring. So I think there's that to be optimistic about, but I don't know in terms of this kind of ground truth of information. Like it's not ours in the same way, and it's not even written down in the same way. It's like implicit in these weights.
Yeah. So if you were to go back again in time, and you mentioned, I didn't realize it was exactly 2 years. I didn't realize you published it in March 23. What did you think you got right? And
3 years ago.
Oh my gosh! Oh wow! It is 3 years ago. Wow, makes even more of a profit in that case. So, yeah. So you got obviously a lot of things right, but I'm curious, what did you feel like, again, looking back now in the review mirror, what do you think you got wrong, or maybe not wrong, but incomplete? Obviously, you mentioned at the time there was just the one sort of big play in the space. Now there's a few. Is there anything else that stands out that kind of changes the picture? And as you said, this could be both for the better or not really.
I guess the observations in the essay still stand. I'll tell you the things that I feel that are different now than I felt then. One is that this first part of it happened in some ways less quickly than I expected it to. Although it's happened very, very fast, I think it didn't happen quite. I think it's just easy to extrapolate forward on these things and then just think everything's going to happen all at once, and it doesn't. And it takes a while for people to catch up. And so, in some ways, it's a bit slower. I mean, I was advising at the time that I wrote that essay. I was working with the Archie and Richard Hollingsworth, who were running a virtual assistant company at the time, and I was helping them create strategy for how to, like, whether they could start an AI company. And I remember, because we did loads of work kind of running through their historic work and what their virtual assistants have been doing and so on, to see what opportunities there were for AI. And then they ended up settling on these ideas of labeling emails and drafting emails and rescheduling appointments. And we all felt at the time, we were like, okay, well, this clearly needs to be done. The reason they knew it needed to be done was because we'd run this process to analyze what people had historically been paying their real world virtual assistants for. But also we were like, it's kind of mad to do this, like, because this is like square in the middle of Apple and Google and Microsoft. So, like, I always use the analogy that you're building in the avalanche zone, and as soon as one of these companies lets off the snow above you, like, you're going to get run out. But to that point, we're 3 years on from that, and Fyxer's still like growing and strong as a company. I mean, still, it is now extremely big and strong as a company. So in some ways, things have happened much slower, and then in other ways, there's moments like last December where, like, there are still these inflection points where things change qualitatively in ways that you can feel, but you can almost not even describe in the moment.
What do you think made Fyxer work so well then? So you kind of mentioned that they obviously run a virtual assistant business before and they deeply understood the problem that needed to be solved. So that's clearly a big advantage. But is it really a competitive moat, right? It kind of sounds like it might be because, as you say, we're 3 years on and they're doing better than ever, it sounds like. So what is it that makes them so successful?
I can't speak to their current product strategy because I don't know their current product strategy, and I don't know whether they have a moat or not. I'm just not close enough to them to know. I can say what made them work at the start. And at the start, I think it was a very, very well aligned company. So most startups, as you and I know from having been to lots of pitch days, where you sit there in the audience and really all you hope for from the pitch is not this is going to be $100 million company. You just hope they're going to describe some problem you can wrap your head around,
right,
that seems vaguely plausible, that where the unit economics make any sense at all. Like if you can answer yes to those three questions, then like okay, but that's nice. Thank you for making me feel good about your company. So I think the problem that most startups have is that they don't choose something that matters, and or they don't choose something they can do, or like the gap between the thing that they're trying to create is so hazy that like an amorphous that could be a million different things. And I think with Fyxer, like initially, the idea of Fyxer creating a tech company was a very odd one because there were two completely non-technical founders who had been running a regular virtual assistant company for 8 years. But they were, in a way that I didn't realize when we first started working together, they were very, very ambitious. So there was that at the start. They'd learned a lot from doing a VA company. Then the process that I helped them run meant that they picked the right thing. So because I spent so much time with startups and building startups that don't match things that people really want, that I've kind of developed a visceral reaction to anything that doesn't do that. And so when I started working with them, I said to them, look, you're not technical, and there's going to be like hundreds of young like MIT grads running to San Francisco to go and start AI assistant companies. The thing that you have that they don't have is you have 8 years of data on what like millions of pounds worth of money has been spent on actually making VAs do. So what we can do is we can pick off the jobs in that stack that we know that people pay for, and then we can whittle them down by the ones that I'm reasonably confident that AI can do. And it was like, when we started, there was not even OpenAI didn't even have an API. Like it was only a rumor that they were producing an API, but we thought it was worth running on that.
Right.
So we ran a process that got them to a product that kind of people demonstrably wanted. Then I think a few other things were really unusual about how they fitted together and worked. There were a sequence of things that happened that worked really well. The CTO that they got, Matt French, is he's an unusually good balance of extremely focused and quite flexible. And he was very, very customer obsessed. So he just cared about making the product better, and he worked very, very, very fast. Archie just cared about selling, and all he'd ever done was sell the Fyxer VA product.
Right.
And he just went out there and kept doing the same thing he always did. And you're a great appreciator of the world of sales, I know.
Sure am.
And Archie's a great salesman, and he just kept pushing it. And so there was this super healthy tension between Archie selling and Matt responding very, very quickly to the feedback from people. And they started experimenting early with growth stuff too. And then I'd say the kind of the next few bits that worked unusually well are that I think Richard is a very good team builder. and he's a very, very steady hand on the tiller. And so there was this excellent balance between kind of tech and product, sales, and company building, where the company building was bringing in capital and hiring people. And two other people I think were, maybe three other people I think were very impactful in that, and I don't know one of their names, but they got a growth guy who was at Grapple and has done this in a few places. He's very good with growth. He set up their growth, kind of set it up as a discipline. They got him in. I think Andrew Richardson was very impactful to them in terms of hiring. And I think Harry Steppings was very impactful to them. I think like his amplification of that, I mean, aside from his money, his amplification of their brand, like all of these things really, really resonated. And so they just rode it up. They did really well.
The perfect storm, it sounds like. But I really liked the first thing you said in particular, which is this idea of not going for product market fit, but rather for market product, if that makes sense. So really leading with the problem that you need to solve rather than, hey, we've built this thing, let's see if we can sell it. To your point, I think this is something that 9 out of 10 times gets missed.
Yeah, it is. It is so easy to build rather than validate.
Yeah. Do you think this is going to become more prolific as building becomes easier compared to before? I mean, it was always a problem, right? Kind of going off and deciding to build before you have validated an idea per se. But now it just seems so easy. I wonder whether we see even more of this, or to your point, now we can not just use AI to build, but also to strategize. And therefore you might reduce the projects that basically have no legs to begin with. What is your take here?
I don't think most people want to strategize. Right. Most people want to build the thing they want to build.
Right.
And to the extent they want a strategy that validates that they should build that thing. So I suspect we're going to see, by virtue of so many people building, I think more people will be building something in the right spot. And by virtue of the kind of breadth now, like, startups would always most service the people who, the areas in which software developers worked. Mm-hmm. Like it was just par for the course, because the software developers were there, they saw a problem and they built for it. But now many, many more people are software developers than were before. And one of the clients I'm working with actually is a perfect example of this. Like he works in property firm, and they have a portfolio of companies, and he watched the way that repairs get managed on their properties and the toing and froing between electricians and residents to make sure that they're all lined up and the work gets done and the electrician understands the problem and everything else. And he vibe coded an app to solve it. And it was good, and it was good enough that he then reached out to me, and then we started working together. And then he hired a really, really good developer who came in and graduated it up. And now that is in the wild, doing like repairs every single day.
This probably is a good segue into your second essay that I mentioned in the opening, which I thought was even more striking than the first one. Very different. You know, in the first one, you kind of talk about the system. In the second one, you basically were describing your own personal experience, as I said, and how you basically felt like, and I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, so, you know, keep me honest here, but you kind of felt like you were taking the back seat from sort of directing the AI monitoring to basically not being able to keep up with it, right? Is that a fair summary of that essay?
It's kind of hard to express exactly. That essay was an attempt to express what I felt. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting seeing people's reactions to that, and other senior developers I know, who I know are also very AI forward. But yeah, that week that I wrote that essay, I think Claude 4.6 was released, and I'd really been coming up to speed with agents inside Claude Code and kind of getting a feel for them. And I think what was becoming clear was that the the rate of change was such that these things that we are still at a point, I'm still at a point where my input on the code that's written has dramatic effect on the quality of the code. Mm-hmm. But the degree to which that is true is so much less than it was a year ago or 2 years ago. Like, and the work that I'm doing has changed so much that it was hard. As I was using this stuff, I was like, well, if you keep drawing this line out, I mean, maybe there's something special that I have that it doesn't, but empirically, like, this is like degrees of magic already. Like, I never thought we were going to be in a world where like we'd have computers that could talk to us and could write code. So that like magic boundary was crossed a long, long time ago. And then the quality gradient's been going up like this. So I'm like, I can't think of a way in which like I'm that much more special to it. And I can keep riding this wave, and the wave gets bigger and it gets faster. And for now, I am still riding it, but I was like, I don't know where this ends or how this plays out. And obviously, if you listen to Dario from Anthropic, like he's got a much more fatalist take on it than I have. I think he's got a much better feel for how it plays out.
Well, I wanted to ask you actually what your take is. Again, like I don't want to go into scaremongering territory, but again, the language that you used in that essay when you were describing your influence was quite visceral, right? It said it's shifting more from boost to drag, right? This is pretty dramatic. And so I took away from that. And again, maybe no. Again, you wrote this like a month ago, give or take, maybe a couple of months. I can't remember. That was this year. Again, you think it might have changed a lot, but again, my take reading this was like, "Ooh, Pete is feeling uneasy about this as well." And again, you know, you've been writing consistently about this for quite some time, and as far as I could tell, you keep on nailing it and getting things right. And so I look at this, and I started like getting a little bit uncomfortable. So really wanted to speak to you about it.
So it's interesting. That boost to drag comment, there's quite a lot in that. Mm-hmm. Right now, the limiting factor on what the AI can do is the amount of time that a human can spend at the computer. And for almost all developers, and I know there's some out there that are running Ralph Wiggum loops on like multiple things simultaneously, and I have no idea what code they're producing. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they have any idea what code they're producing either. But for anybody who wants any degree of architectural oversight or quality oversight on what's going on, the output that you can create is limited by the amount of oversight that you can have over the AI. The AI spends way, way, way more time not writing code than it does writing code. And so, and it used to be that the AI was the assist to me. And so I was like, I mean, it's academic. Like, it's not like it's going to write when I'm not, because it can't write anything like the caliber that I can. And then that shifted, and whilst it still needs quite a lot of kind of guardrails, in order to write the caliber of code that I would expect of it, it needs guardrails and it needs checks. In fact, sorry, I'm going to go back a step because I'm just thinking about that particular comment and what I was thinking at the point I wrote that particular comment and what changed since then. So I think at the point I wrote that comment, I was still essentially kind of prompting the AI synchronously and getting it to go and do chunks of work and then reviewing it, which has essentially been the MO that I've had ever since AI kind of gone into the IDE. So I will prompt it, it'll do a bunch of work. I will do live code review where essentially kind of as it develops stuff, I'll stage it when I sign it off and to and fro with it until I'm happy with it, and then stage it and then commit. And then that's that's done. And then I do a big AI code review at the end. So that was my modus operandi, probably at the point I wrote that essay.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just becoming clear to me that the rate at which it was writing high quality code was just like, I was now really the limiting effect on this. Like there wasn't so much, the drag effect of me being in there was really dramatic. The consequence of that, though, was to move to this factory paradigm. And in the factory paradigm, I think the idea is generally like to constantly be looking at your process, one's own process, and thinking, what am I doing that I could give the AI to do? Or what am I doing that I could give code to do? So at the most basic level, like early on, I was like reformatting stuff and adding horizontal lines, and that can all be done by a linter. So there's absolutely no point in me doing it. And then there's like checks of things like fairly basic level code review stuff. And I knew that the AI could do that. And so between around when I wrote that essay and now, what changed was moving the pipeline, or kind of making the process of developing something a pipeline, where at each step in the pipeline, you run a different process to set you up for the next step in the pipeline. And by doing that, basically the objective is to minimize the amount of time that I have to input for a given chunk of output, and maximize and minimize minimize the number of times I need to interject a process in order for it to complete, and then also minimize the amount that I need to inject at each point in order to make sure it's doing well. So by breaking the whole process down and splitting it up into what I currently do, which is I essentially have two different factories. One's a design factory and one's a build factory. And I'll take the build factory because it's a more straightforward one. But the build factory will start by kind of gathering context and maybe even doing an initial spike of what's going to be done. It will then, there'll be some critics applied to it, and the critics will make sure that the naming and like the architecture matches the rest of the project, and the spike will be torn down, and the spec will be updated, and then a build will happen, and then a refactoring, and then a series of tests. And then I have this chaos monkeys step, which is designed to break the code in a way that makes it fail according to the spec, and to see whether that's caught by the tests. And if it's not caught by the tests, new tests get written. And then at the end, it does a retrospective on everything that's done, and it writes up a PR pull request, and it writes a report and it all. So the kind of discovering that I was dragging the process at that kind of inline, hand-in-hand stage, the discovery of that meant I had to rethink what my role in the process was. And my role in the process became not hand-holding it at each stage, but automating the things that I was doing to handhold it such that it could do them without me.
Right. Well, this is actually great, because there was something else that you wrote there that really stood out to me, which is this idea of not just automating the work, but you're actually automating the act of automation, right? I think you mentioned in the essay that you're building agents that can basically tell you what else you can automate that you shouldn't be doing, in line with what you just said about reducing the drag, right? This seems to be a pretty kind of recursive loop, right? It doesn't seem to be a ceiling to it, if you see what I mean. If you keep on using automation to find what else could be automated, like, is there a ceiling at all?
Yeah, that's the question. And that's where I think what's interesting is that these kind of recursive improvement loops are happening at several levels in all of this.
Yeah.
So you're seeing the models themselves have these recursive loops, both in the pre-training and then in the post-training as well.
Mm-hmm.
And there's these agentic layers like Claude Code, which is itself being recursively improved. And then people like me are building other recursive improvements on top of that. And so, yeah, it's a lot of, it can make you a bit dizzy.
Yeah. I guess my question here, and is I think an obvious one, is at what point, like, what probably is left for you, right? Like, if you keep on sort of automating yourself out, I can totally see how this makes sense to improve efficiency, but at some point, there won't be anything left for you to do. And we always used to say, you know, when building companies, as a CEO, as a founder, the best way to ensure that you're successful is to essentially, build in such a way that you don't need to be there anymore. But is this applicable here at all? Are you sort of directing the system or observing it?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think there's another question that goes with it, because I think there's two things simultaneously going on here. One is that builders are loving building and are talking about building a lot. And the other is that stuff that people use is getting built. Mm-hmm. And those two are related, but they're not the same thing. So given I don't know whether it's a valid question. I don't know what the answer to it is. Given the massive explosion in the rate of production of code and the ease of creating applications and so on, I don't feel like we're using proportionally more software to reflect it. Like, I feel like there's still quite a big gap between everybody building all of this stuff and people building stuff people want to use. Mm-hmm. Sorry, excuse me. And so the reason I mention that is coming back to your question, like, what's still there? I think this is like in any factory optimization process. What happens, and I'm not a factory optimizer, but I've read a little bit about factory optimization.
Well, it seems like you're running a factory right now.
The bottleneck travels. Yeah. Well, not a real world factory, not one that most cars get built in.
Right.
But whenever there's a really good book called The Goal, basically. There's a book called The Goal that a friend called Glenn Smith recommended to me. And it's an excellent description of essentially kind of looking at the factory process and understanding where the inventory is and where the delays are and what's bottlenecking things. But essentially, it's a dynamic problem. The bottleneck constantly moves around the factory. And so I think in the factory where the factory is like human latent demand in at one end and product that services that demand out at the other end. Well, ideally, product that services that demand in the hands of that consumer out at the other end. Mm. There's lots of different steps in there. Like historically, we've been bottlenecked by the production of code. But that bottleneck is loosening, but it doesn't remove the other bottlenecks in there. So to your question, I suspect that we're going to be shifting where we place our emphasis. And I think that if code, and it's not there yet, but if we really do get to a point where we can get such high caliber code out at an unlimited rate, which, I mean, as mental as this is as a statement, may be something that happens in the next 12 months.
Yeah.
That is definitely going to, I mean, I don't know whether I always look at everything through the lens of the startup rather than the developer.
Yeah.
In the startup, the bottleneck's going to move to a different point. From the perspective of developers, I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah. What about if you zoom even further out and you kind of look at this from, the perspective of humans, if that makes sense. The reason why I keep on pushing you on this is because I've been thinking about this through a specific lens, right? This really feels, particularly the example that you give in the essay, it really feels like a Moloch problem, right? Individually, it makes total sense for you to be automating everything when it comes to writing code, but collectively, you might be automating yourself out of relevance. So on an individual level, if you go back to your essay, it makes total sense for you to be automating everything, right? You just want to stay competitive. If you don't do it, someone else will do it. And again, if you were a company builder or even allocating capital, whichever way you want to look at it, it just makes sense. In order for you to stay in the game and stay competitive, you are incentivized to automate absolutely everything. But collectively, once everyone starts doing this, and I don't think they have a choice, you essentially end up automating yourself out of relevance. And this is kind of what I took away from your comments around your involvement in the programming process, right? So the more you automate, the less involved you are. And at some point, you're completely outperformed. And this was a thread I kind of felt you very neatly kind of weaved in your first post as well. I think you had something along the lines of, we have historically used, and you used the term the machine, which I thought was great. We've used the machine to store our repository of knowledge. And now we don't even know who stores it, etc. So, again, like I kind of see this as a bit of an incentive conflict here, individual versus societal level, if that makes sense.
So talking about optimization at this level and kind of optimizing oneself out of the loop.
Yeah.
Remember at the start of COVID, I'm inclined to be catastrophist about things. It's the way my mind runs. I will kind of naturally run something out to its most catastrophic conclusion. And so at the start of COVID, I saw the figures and saw that it was more potent than the Spanish flu and more virulent than the Spanish flu, and I knew how many people died in the Spanish flu, so I was like, okay, well, that seems like a bad outcome. And I didn't have, whilst I knew that we lived in a different world from then, I wasn't able to get past the kind of the magnitude of that and the significance of that as a conclusion. And it left me feeling very sad. And what I didn't account for was, number one, the degree of change that society was willing to take on to keep COVID at bay, and the whole staying at home thing, which I just would never have conceived would have happened. And number two, that we produced a vaccine so quickly. So I think the reason I mention that is that I suspect that I think there's a number of different, there are probably a number of different systems that exist in the world that they were first conceived of, like whether it's fractional banking or like nuclear weaponry, or COVID or AI, that if you were there as a thinking person at the start, you would naturally extrapolate it out and you'd be like, I don't see how this ends anything other than in, like, just statistically, it's not going to work. Mm. And yet we have a tendency to like pull very high impact, very statistically unlikely events out of the mix. That's like what we're good at doing as humans. So I think unchecked, if you let this whole thing play out, then it probably does result in like some pretty dire outcomes, but it won't be unchecked. And it's definitely going to be very different, and it may be catastrophic, but it's definitely not going to play out according to any obvious expectation that we have at the moment.
Again, the reason why I've been pushing so hard on the topic in general is because I essentially do view this very much as a Moloch problem. The idea being that individually makes total sense for you to be automating as much of your day-to-day job as you possibly can, because if you don't, someone else will do it, and then essentially you're going to fall behind, right? So you're incentivized to do so, but the more we do this collectively, you essentially end up automating yourself out of relevance. And so if we assume that to be the case, which I think is fair to say now that is the case, the broader question is, where does our value as human actually lie?
I mean, one thing I would point out with that is that we'll have to cross a phase boundary for this to be true, because at the moment what's happening is that the more people are getting into this, the more valuable they are. They're more leveraged, and there's more output per hour of input, which, like everything we've ever done, turns out is even more exhausting. So all of this stuff that's supposed to take your work off you just means that your work is now more and more focused and more intense.
Yeah.
So I think in order for that to be the case, there does need to be a phase shift. There needs to be a phase shift where the human isn't adding any extra value in controlling the AI. I'm going to take a step back, actually, because it's very hard to reason about any of these things at the singularity, or kind of at the asymptote, and you just get caught up in the same things that are getting discussed everywhere, and kind of the same conclusions. And I just don't know how helpful they are. I don't think things are going to change. I think similarly to the last 3 years, some things are going to change more dramatically than we expect. Many things are going to change far less dramatically than we expect. There's a huge amount of inertia and dissipation, and there's a huge amount of inertia in changing people's behavior. And there's some time that it takes for things to dissipate. I also think that a lot of people are in jobs because other people want to work with people. And I don't think that's going to change as fast as people imagine. I think there's lots of data to show that lots of jobs that currently exist don't even need to exist now, never mind when AI comes along. I have a friend who did kind of workforce audits for large companies, and every time they'd come in and they'd identify at least 30% of the workforce that wasn't really in a true job, and the company would remove them, and the company would accelerate as a result. And that kind of pruning process is something that I think disciplined companies do on a regular basis. But I think the reason that they need to be pruned is that we don't, as individuals, primarily care about the velocity of the company that we're working for. We care about ourselves, and we care about having colleagues, and we care about being in control of people and having fiefdoms and power and status and all of the things that come from humans. So I think that the ability, I don't think this necessarily protects us, and I'm not holding this out as some kind of magical shield to protect from the AI. The reason I share it, though, is that I think that there are more incentives in what we're talking about than just sheer productivity.
Yeah.
And so I definitely don't have the answers. Nobody has the answers. But I think it's worth thinking about these things, because otherwise it's possible for your mind to destroy itself in the thoughts about this, and that doesn't lead to anything good.
No.
I mean, I was thinking the other day, I was away skiing last week, and I saw an advert for an Audi driving through the Alps, and can you imagine the life that you live if you had this Audi in the Alps? I recall exactly the same advert being run every single year, into my childhood. And those adverts are entirely exactly the same. And Audi spends whatever they spend, £60,000 to put a team of photographers out there into the Alps and shoot the latest car driving with some skis on the top through the Alps on a sunny day. and telling you that your life's going to change as a result of getting this Audi. And it's exactly the same photo they've taken forever, and they don't need to take that photo next year because they can just tell the AI to produce that photo. But I also thought, for as long as we can tell the difference between, and maybe we won't be able to tell the difference, but for as long as we can tell a difference or even hear a different story about how something's been created, there will still be demand for it to be created that way. Like people still like home cooked food is like or like non-factory prepared by hand it's still a mark of excellence. And so there's a lot of, and that's not to say that most food people eat now is not prepared in a factory and consumed without people caring that it was in a factory. But my point is that there's a lot of forces at play, and I think it's impossible to think it through, but you have to understand these forces are there, all pulling different directions, and the outcome is not going to be the simplistic single dimensional outcome that one's brain naturally tends to go to.
Fair enough. So if you were to, if we were to kind of compare those two essays that he wrote, one 3 years ago, not two, 3 years ago, and one more recently, would you say you're more optimistic now or less optimistic about the future?
I mean, if we put aside Donald and did you say optimistic?
Yeah, or more pessimistic. You could take either side of the bet, if you will. Again, reading your writing, these particular essays, those two that I, keep on referencing, they're the ones that really stood out to me for a number of reasons. As I said, one, they were very forward thinking, and I think they kind of took a stab at predicting what's going to happen, and I think a lot of it has actually come to pass. But then also, especially with the second one, I kind of felt like a bit more of a pessimistic tone to it. And that's why I'm curious, where do you see it? Is it a more, with everything that we're accomplishing right now, are we saying we're going to have a more optimistic or pessimistic future? That doesn't even make sense, but
I think I just don't want to place my money on either bet. I think I've got no intrinsic sense. I can't see beyond the next 2 years. I just don't know what happens past that horizon at all. Everything's gonna be so different. But I think because everything's going to be so different, and because all of this stuff is going to be so impactful, and because it's impossible, I mean, maybe Elon can model it, but for the rest of us, there are very few of us who can model at any degree of accuracy how this is going to play out. And again, I would stress the effect of very high impact, very low probability outcomes in the way that humanity moves forward. We don't move forward statistically, according to the stats. We're highly, our progress is highly displaced by people like Elon Musk or Linus Torvalds or any of these other people that have completely outsized effects on things and completely change stuff. I mean, Sam, the team at OpenAI. So given that one can't predict there, I actually think there's something else really important to do at this stage, which is to manage one's own mind. I think everybody's trying themselves nuts, trying to predict which outcome. And the goal with predicting the outcome is finding something that's comforting. And I think this is a weird faith-based thing for somebody who is an atheist to say about something that is being driven by computers. Right. But I actually think you kind of have to have faith. I think this is a point where you have to choose to be optimistic. And your outcome, if you reframe it, and given that none of us can predict what's going to happen, I think the more important thing is to think about thinking in frames that allow for optimism, because that is far more likely to lead to better outcomes in each local scenario than not.
Yeah. And if you were to be very practical, you are a father, so am I. I think you made a great point that you right now are kind of trying not to think maybe more than 2 years into the future because it's just unrealistic. You cannot know what's going to happen 2 years into the future, right? I remember when I was growing up, you would regularly have conversations with your parents about, what you want to do when you grow up and career choices and choices around, GCSEs, A levels, university, etc. Are you having these conversations? And I appreciate our kids are still fairly young, but how do you approach this whole topic? Do you even think about it? What do you tell your kids, or what are you planning to tell them? How should one navigate this particular minefield?
I mean, my son's too young to be worrying about more than where his next car's coming from at the moment. And I mean, to the other point, like I don't think about it because I think there's too much change to be able to think it through. I mean, I think about the things that we can control. I think about which school he's going to go to, and I think about how we're going to parent him, and you just kind of you think about all these regular things, but at the other levels, it's so impossible to process what's going to happen in that time frame that I don't think about it. Other than that, a friend of mine, Sophie Dean, is thinking a lot about how to create a school that resembles the Alpha School from the States here in London, and I would be very pro that, because I feel that the distinction between school as childcare and school as a teaching institution and school as a social institution, like we've never been able to split those up before, but we can now. And I think the teaching part of it seems unlikely to me that it's not better delivered by AI. So I'd love to see, I hope that we will see some dramatic changes in schooling.
Yeah. Cool. Final thing for me, a good way to kind of wrap up here. If you were to project 2 more years into the future, again, I maybe 3, because the last, and I know you said you don't think you try to avoid thinking in increments of 2 years when it comes to predictions. But if you were to do it, what would your third essay, if you're assuming that, the 2 I keep on referencing were, a sequence, what would the third one be like? What do you think?
Say that again. What would the third essay?
Yeah, so the first one being the Stack Overflow one, where the system essentially was changing. The second one being, you and your own relevance as a developer, and how you think about your or builder and your kind of role in the process. Extrapolate, I was going to say 3 years into the future, basically, give another 3 years gap in between, but maybe 2 now that you've said. What do you see that essay being like?
All right, I'll share some thoughts on some things, like some specific things that kind of seem sensible to me, but one suspicion I have is, let's talk about software for a second. The societal impact stuff I don't have such a good feel on, but let's talk about software in its own right. So I feel like for the next 12 months at least, and maybe on an ongoing basis, that there will still be structural advantages go to higher quality teams in software. There is a chance that the AI gets so good that the skill of the operator doesn't matter at all. And we are in a never say never world right now. But if we assume that the skill of the operator does matter, and I think you could project that for at least the next 12 months, there's a few different things that I think are interesting thought experiments. So one is one is the question of like, what would an internal software team look like? And would you have an internal software team? Because one of the things that I think is, you could argue is going to be true, is that all teams are going to accelerate, and the best teams are going to accelerate faster than all the other teams. And that means there's going to come a point where like it doesn't make sense to the best team could be 100 times or 1,000 times better than the next team back.
Mm.
And at that point, when people start offering those services to the market directly, why would you run an internal software team when you can buy direct from something that's 100 times the quality and maybe a fraction of the time? So one thing I'm interested in is, do we start to see the disappearance of lots of internal software teams? And if we do, what still remains inside the company? And interestingly, and I hadn't thought about this, but I think you could kind of ask this question historically, and why didn't people outsource, and then why did people offshore and then reshore? And it turned out that I think the answer to that was that if you had high frequency need to get information about the software being produced, then the delays that came about through like offshoring it or outsourcing it meant that the overall rate at which you could produce it dropped, even if you got much cheaper developers and more of them, just because the toing and froing meant that like these recursive loops that you want to improve things weren't there, and so the quality was much lower. But I think it's funny because I've been thinking about this topic as its whole as a whole for a while, and starting to think, well, if teams run these extremely high caliber factories and they're able to produce extraordinarily good software and much better than internal teams could do it, why would you not pay them to do it? And I suspect that we might see a little bit more of a formal division between the design process and the development process, to the extent that once the development is fully spec'd, you can kind of almost imagine that overnight the software gets delivered.
Wow.
Like once the spec is there, then by the next day the software will be there, which seems like mental. But then 200 years ago, it'd be pretty mental at like you give an envelope to somebody and it would be in the Americas like next morning. But that happens, and so I think that is very viable. That like I think it's extremely viable. I mean, I think arguably we're already there now. But that level of spec can be delivered on an overnight. And then the question becomes like, what remains inside the company? And I think that there is the most time consuming part for me now, the most time consuming part of producing software is defining what software needs to be built. Like there's a moment between when you start working with the AI and when you're comfortable that the AI is on the same page as you. And so there's a lot of interaction that happens at the start of the build process, which I think people could naively confuse with being a plan, but it's not a plan. I've seen a dev give like 3-line instructions to the AI, and the AI came back with a 15-page plan. And he was like, look, isn't that amazing? And I was like, no, like, look at the entropy between like what you've just told them and what they've decided. Like, how many gaps do you think there are between what the amount of input that you've given and the amount of decisions that this thing has made? It's like, there's so many things that could exist in what hasn't been defined. So actually there's a lot of to and fro that has to happen to adequately communicate and synthesize and manifest what is in the product owner's mind into a specification. So that part is the most time-consuming part, right? Or I'm not saying right. It is, in my experience, the most time-consuming part.
Yeah.
Once that's been done, and I have a whole design factory that's designed to do that, and that starts by doing that, and then mocks stuff up, and then like reconfirms things, then goes off and explores the code base, and comes to a thesis about what stuff needs to be used and what stuff needs to be changed in order to do this, and then kind of reconfirms with me. And then at the end of all of that, what I would expect is like a really, really clear spec where I'm like, if this is built according to this spec, then I'll get what I want. And if I don't get what I want, then either the build factory failed or the spec was incomplete. So I think this build stage of things, whether the AI fully wraps it and we even need an external company or not, I think that part of it is like the input of humans on that is tending towards zero.
Yeah.
I think the ability of the AI to just build to a specification is probably already there today, like with the right guardrails around it. The question of how you decide what to build and how you get a vision out of somebody's head and how you marry that with the data and everything else is a whole new area to start implementing AI and feedback loops and everything else. But it's definitely the next. It's not the part. It's the part that isn't currently being tackled by the vast majority of teams. I'm certain that the cutting edge in San Francisco are doing this. And I'm certain that they are taking customer feedback, they're clustering it, they're resolving it into theses, they are mocking up different UIs, they're maybe like A/B testing that, and that is definitely the future.
Who owns that?
But the vast majority of people are not.
So is this a brand new team that basically is tasked with figuring this out? Is this something that sits with marketing, with product, with growth?
Say that again, Dimitar.
I was thinking, this particular vision of the future you describe, who owns this function within the, company 3.0? Is it something that the growth team owns? Is it something the product owns? Is it marketing? Or is it something completely brand new, as you said, that doesn't even exist just now?
I would be really surprised if we don't see a lot of these. I don't know. I don't know. And I don't know. I don't work enough with big companies to answer that question well. But if you look at if those three teams are running really well, they should be, I would assume, and you've worked in larger companies than I have, but you'd want them to be very much on the same page with stuff, very much singing from the same hymn sheet on everything and working in unison. And you would also assume I think I would be surprised if once the devs have automated their job, they don't get applied to automating some of these jobs as well.
Oh, man. Final thing, where can people keep up with you? So where's the best way, basically, for anyone to follow your thinking and how this evolves?
That is a really good question. For the time being, just on LinkedIn. So Peter Nixey, Nixey on LinkedIn.
Thanks, Peter. This has been amazing. I really appreciate your time.
Hopefully it's all recorded. Thanks so much, Dimitar. Lovely to speak. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.